Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're going to look at a very interesting case, the Smurl Haunting. It's been a case that's fascinated people for decades, and we're really going to dig into it.
Yeah, it's really one of those that I think is a quintessential American haunting. I mean, it's got everything right.
Right.
It's got the family and the, strange phenomena that just escalates and escalates. It gets the attention of Ed and Lorraine Warren, who are kind of celebrities in this world.
Of course, yeah.
And then you've got, media coverage, a book, a TV movie. So it really kind of, hits all the marks of like a really, well-known American haunting.
So let's start with kind of setting the scene a little bit. The Smurl family lived in West Pittston, Pennsylvania.
Right.
And this was during the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, it began in 1974. They moved into this house, a double block house on Chase Street. And nothing seemed out of the ordinary for the first years. I think it was about a year that they were living there when things started to happen.
Yeah. And it's interesting because a lot of times when you hear about hauntings, there's like a history to the house.
Right.
Or the location.
Right.
But in this case, it seems like there wasn't anything like that associated with this house before they moved in.
As far as we know, there's no real history of anything strange happening at this house prior to them moving in.
Right.
Which I think makes it even spookier.
Right.
Like it just came out of nowhere.
Yeah, it wasn't like that, they moved in and people were like, oh my God, that house.
Right.
Good luck.
Exactly. Yeah. It wasn't known to be haunted.
So the family, Jack and Janet Smurl, and they had 4 children.
That's right.
What started to happen? I mean, what were some of the first indications that something wasn't quite right?
Well, it began like so many hauntings do, with, little things. Just strange smells that they couldn't explain, sounds, temperature fluctuations, just kind of the classic, almost cliche haunting type phenomena.
So they probably just dismissed it as like, oh, the house is old or...
Exactly. I'm sure they did at first.
Yeah.
Just kind of rationalizing it away as, this is just an old house and these things happen.
But then things started to escalate, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. It started to become much more intense and frequent and just stranger.
So like, what are some of the examples of that?
Well, there were reports of objects moving seemingly on their own, doors slamming shut or opening, just things of that nature. But then it started to get more physical.
Right.
There were claims that the furniture was being shaken violently, that members of the family were being pushed or shoved or even scratched.
I had read some reports that the family dog was actually thrown against a wall.
Yeah, that's one of the claims.
Yeah.
That the family dog was actually physically picked up and hurled against the wall. Now, whether that actually happened, obviously there's no way to really prove it,
right? But
that's what the family claimed.
And one of the daughters was pushed down the stairs.
Yeah, one of the daughters was supposedly pushed down the stairs. I think she may have even sustained some minor injuries.
Yeah.
So it was definitely starting to escalate beyond just your typical, things going bump in the night kind of haunting.
Yeah, that's definitely getting into like dangerous territory.
Yeah, absolutely. Like poltergeist activity almost.
So at this point, the family is starting to really get concerned. I mean, it's not just a nuisance anymore. It's actually impacting their safety.
Absolutely. And they're a religious family. They were Catholic.
Okay.
And so I think that adds a whole other layer of fear to this. If you believe that there are demonic forces at work, it's not just something that's, annoying you. It's something that could potentially be, putting your soul at risk.
Right.
So I think the religious aspect of this really amplified their fear.
And we're going to talk about the religious aspect in just a second, but I want to rewind just a tiny bit and ask you this. So we're saying that there wasn't necessarily a history to this house before they moved in. But was there any specific event or incident that happened that kind of made them think like, okay, this is more than just an old house?
There was one incident that I think really stood out to them.
Yeah.
They had a religious statue in their home.
Okay.
And they claimed that one day they found it had been desecrated.
Oh.
Possibly even like overturned or defaced in some way.
Right.
And I think as a devout Catholic family, that was incredibly disturbing to them. It felt like a very personal attack. Something that was meant to kind of, really get to them on a spiritual level.
Right.
So I think that incident, more than any other, really kind of solidified their fear that this was something evil.
So at this point, they're realizing, okay, something's not right. We've got to try to get some answers.
Yeah.
What did they do?
Well, they started reaching out to people.
Yeah.
They consulted with priests. They brought in psychics.
Okay.
They even contacted some paranormal investigators.
Yeah.
I think even before the Warrens got involved, they had other people come in and try to figure out what was going on.
And what was kind of the response? I mean, did anybody have any definitive answers?
Not really. I mean, it's one of those things where if you're dealing with something that's potentially paranormal, there's no easy answers.
Right.
Some people might say, oh, it's definitely ghosts or it's definitely demons. Other people might say, well, maybe it's something psychological,
Sure.
So I think they were getting a lot of different opinions and not a lot of concrete answers.
So let's fast forward a little bit. It's now 1986. They've been living with this for over a decade. At this point, it's really starting to impact their lives in a significant way. They reach out to Ed and Lorraine Warren.
Yes.
Now, for people who don't know who Ed and Lorraine Warren are, maybe just give us a little background on these two.
Sure. So Ed and Lorraine Warren were probably the most famous paranormal investigators of the 20th century. Ed was a demonologist, which means he was a self-proclaimed expert in demonology.
Okay.
Lorraine was a clairvoyant and a medium. So they kind of had this husband and wife's team where they were both interested in the paranormal, and they really kind of made it their life's work to investigate these cases.
And they had been involved in a lot of high-profile cases even before this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, they're probably most famous for the Amityville horror case,
right,
which also became a book and a movie. But they investigated tons of cases all over the world.
Yeah, so these were kind of the big guns in the world of paranormal investigation at the time.
Oh, absolutely. They were the go-to people.
So what did they make of the Smurl haunting? I mean, did they confirm the family's suspicions?
Well, their findings were pretty dramatic.
Okay.
They did say that they believed the house was infested with demons.
Okay.
Not just one demon, but multiple entities.
Oh.
They claimed to have witnessed all kinds of phenomena. Furniture shaking violently, a dark, shadowy mass manifesting in the house. Ed even claimed that he received a message on a mirror.
Whoa.
Telling him to get out of the house.
So are we talking like bloody writing on the mirror, or?
I don't know the specifics of how the message appeared.
Okay.
I think it was more like, just words that kind of appeared on the mirror.
Wow, that's scary.
Yeah, very creepy.
That is creepy. Did they ever produce any evidence to support these claims? I mean, were there any photographs or recordings or anything like that?
Well, they claimed to have audio recordings of knocking and rapping sounds that they attributed to the demons.
Okay.
But those recordings were never really independently verified or widely released.
Okay.
So, as with a lot of their investigations, it really came down to, believing their word.
Right.
They didn't always provide a lot of hard evidence to support their claims.
But I mean, they were taken seriously. I mean, obviously the Smurl family brought them in and trusted them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think for the Smurl family, having the Warrens come in and validate their experiences must have been both terrifying and reassuring in a way.
Right.
Terrifying because it confirmed their worst fears.
Right.
But also reassuring because finally someone was taking them seriously.
Right.
For years they had probably been, telling people about this and being dismissed or, maybe even ridiculed.
Sure.
So to have these, world famous paranormal investigators come in and say, no, you're right. This is real. This is happening. I think that probably gave them some sense of validation.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
Even though it was also very scary.
So this is just the beginning of the story. This is where things really start to take off and get a lot of attention. So stick with us. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. It's interesting because we're talking about the Warrens and their findings and how they were so dramatic and maybe even a bit sensationalized. But it seems like the media really picked up on this and kind of ran with it too.
The media coverage of this case was huge.
Right.
I mean, it was everywhere.
Yeah.
It was on the news. It was in the newspapers. It was, the talk of the town.
So, I mean, do you think that the media coverage in this case, do you think it helped or hurt the investigation? Or maybe even both?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it definitely raised awareness of the case.
Sure.
Which, in some ways could be seen as a good thing. It brought attention to the Smurl's plight.
Right.
But I also think that it probably contributed to the sensationalism of it all.
Of course. Yeah.
Once the media gets a hold of a story like this, it's hard to keep it grounded in reality.
Right.
They're always looking for the most dramatic angle.
And, especially back in the 80s, I mean, you didn't have the internet or social media. So really the media was the main source of information.
Exactly.
Right.
So whatever they were reporting, people were taking as gospel.
Right. So do you think that the Smurl family, like, how did they handle this media attention? Did they kind of shy away from it, or did they embrace it?
I think it was a bit of both.
Yeah.
They definitely did a lot of interviews.
Yeah.
They were on TV. They were in the newspapers.
Yeah.
I think they even had their own book.
We'll talk about the book in a bit.
Okay.
But, I mean, it must have been overwhelming.
Oh, I'm sure it was.
Yeah.
To have your life suddenly turned into this, national spectacle.
Right.
Can't be easy.
So in the midst of all this media frenzy and the Warrens coming in with their dramatic findings, there were also some people who weren't buying into it.
Oh, yeah.
Right? There were some skeptics who said, wait a minute, this doesn't quite add up.
Absolutely. I mean, I think anytime you have a case like this that gets a lot of attention, you're going to have people who are skeptical.
Sure.
And that's healthy.
Right.
It's important to have people who are questioning the evidence, who are looking at it from a critical perspective.
So who were some of the key skeptics in this case?
Well, one of the most prominent skeptics was a guy named Paul Kurtz.
Okay.
He was a philosopher and a very well-known skeptic.
Okay.
And he was very vocal in his criticism of the Warrens.
Really?
And their methods.
So what was his main argument against what the Warrens were saying?
Well, Kurtz argued that there was no scientific evidence to support the claims of demonic activity.
Right.
He said that a lot of the phenomena that the Smurls were reporting could be explained by natural causes or by psychological factors.
Like what kind of psychological factors?
Well, for example, stress and anxiety can cause people to perceive things that aren't really there.
Okay.
Sleep paralysis is another example where people can feel like they're being held down or choked.
Sure.
So Kurtz was basically saying that, before we jump to the conclusion that this is demonic activity, we need to rule out all other possibilities.
Right. So it's like he was trying to apply a more scientific method to the investigation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was saying that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Right.
And in his opinion, the Warrens were not providing that evidence.
So, I mean, were there any specific details about the Smurl case that Kurtz kind of pointed to that he was like, okay, this could be explained by something else?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that Kurtz pointed out was that Jack Smurl had a history of medical problems.
Okay.
He had undergone surgery to remove fluid from his brain.
Okay.
And he had also suffered from meningitis as a child.
Wow.
So Kurtz suggested that these medical conditions could have potentially played a role in the family's experiences.
So it's like he was saying that maybe these things were happening in their minds.
Right, or that maybe their perceptions were being altered in some way.
Right.
We know that the brain is a very powerful thing.
Of course.
And it can play tricks on us.
So it's not necessarily to say that they were lying or making things up.
Right.
It's just that maybe their interpretation of what was happening was being influenced by these medical conditions.
Right. And Kurtz wasn't the only one who was skeptical. There were other people who came forward and said, maybe this is a case of mass hysteria. Or, maybe the family is subconsciously creating these phenomena.
So you've got this kind of battle going on between the believers and the skeptics.
Right.
And then you have the church right in the middle of all of this.
Right. And the church's response to this case was actually pretty interesting.
So you've got the Warrens saying it's demons. You've got the skeptics saying, well, maybe it's not. And then you have the Catholic Church kind of stuck in the middle of all this.
Yeah. I mean, the Catholic Church has a long history of dealing with cases of alleged demonic possession.
Of course.
And they have a very specific protocol for how to handle these cases.
So what was their response to the Smurl haunting?
With the Diocese of Scranton, which had jurisdiction over the Smurls parish, took a very cautious approach.
Okay.
They didn't just come right out and say, oh, yeah, this is definitely a case of demonic possession.
Right.
They actually sent some priests to the house to investigate.
Really?
To bless the house and to interview the family.
And what did the priests find?
Well, it's interesting because the priests' reports were kind of mixed.
Oh.
Some of the priests said that they felt an unsettling presence in the house.
Okay.
While others said that they didn't feel anything unusual at all.
Wow.
One priest even stayed overnight for 2 nights and said that nothing happened.
So it's almost like the house was reacting differently to different people.
Yeah, it's very strange.
Like maybe it was feeding off of their energy or their beliefs or something.
It's possible.
Yeah.
Some people believe that entities like this can sense whether or not you believe in them.
Right.
And they might be more likely to manifest if they know that you're going to be receptive to it.
That's creepy.
Yeah.
So did the church ever officially perform an exorcism on the Smurl family?
Well, that's where things get a little murky.
Okay.
Janet Smurl claimed that they went through 3 exorcisms.
3.
Performed by an unidentified priest. But the diocese never officially acknowledged or documented these exorcisms.
So it's kind of this mystery whether or not they actually happened.
Yeah, and to this day, we don't know for sure if an exorcism ever took place.
Wow. So with all this going on with the church and the Warrens and the media coverage, what ended up happening to the Smurl family?
Well, they ended up moving out of the house in 1988.
Did they ever find peace?
Well, that depends on who you ask.
Okay.
In 1986, their pastor, Reverend Joseph Edenizio, announced that things had returned to normal for the family.
Really?
He said that they were no longer experiencing any paranormal activity, and he attributed this to intense prayer and spiritual intervention.
But then Janet Smurl came out and said something different, right?
Yeah, just a year later, in 1987, Janet Smurl said that they were still experiencing some activity.
So even after they moved out?
Apparently so.
That's wild. So, I mean, I guess we'll never really know what was going on in that house.
I guess not.
But it's definitely a fascinating case.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those cases that just really captures the imagination.
Yeah, and it kind of makes you wonder about the nature of reality and belief and all that stuff.
Exactly. What do we really know about the world around us? You know, there might be things out there that we just don't understand.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave it for tonight.
Yeah.
This has been a really interesting deep dive into the Smurl haunting.
I agree.
And I hope you all enjoyed it.
Me too.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the unknown.